But while we're waiting for people to maybe log in and maybe more people come into the room here, so two windmills were just doing what they do, just passing the day away, and finally one of them gets bored and starts a conversation with the windmill next to him and said, "So what kind of music do you like?" To which the other windmill responded, "I'm a big metal fan."
Very Sony.
You know, I had a realization over the weekend, and you know, maybe it makes me sound a little bit arrogant, but well, here's an example. You know, it kind of bugs me when people like to pretend that they're as cultured as I am by saying things that they love Mozart, when I know darn well that they've never seen any of his paintings. You know, over the weekend, I ended up running into the richest guy I've ever met. It was just incredible. I mean, the guy was just bragging and found out that he had 6.02 times 10 to the 23rd dollars to his names. That's the first millionaire I've ever met. That's for you chemistry people, if you remember chemistry. Okay, we'll just stop at that point. We're here to talk about highway capacity, and we're really fortunate to have Tony talk about this for Metro District. He's got a lot of really good experience in this area. Capacity is something that I've always found fascinating. How much throughput can you actually get on a set roadway? Depends on the type of roadway, things like that. And you'd be surprised by the things that actually impact capacity. I'm sure Tony's going to be talking about that. Just the grade of the road can impact what the capacity of that road is. So I'm looking forward to this presentation. We've been talking about this for the past half a year, thinking this would be a good presentation for the group. But we're going to have Tony Fisher from Metro District. He's been working at MnDOT since 2000. He has spent almost 10 years. He spent almost 10 years working at the RTMC with ramp meter and loop detectors. And since 2009, he has been in Metro Traffic Engineering's program support group as a freeway analyst. He's got a Master in Science in Applied Economics and a graduate certificate in Transportation Studies from the University of Minnesota. So please help me welcome Tony Fisher.
Thanks, Ken. I've been admiring Ken's humor for a long time, so I just want to take this opportunity to ask him one question, and hope the answer isn't too easy. But what did the Zen Buddhist say to the hot dog vendor? Make me one with everything. Good. So highway capacity. I get to work mostly with freeways, but I'm going to touch on signals because that's actually a harder and more interesting problem sometimes, but freeways have their own fun parts to them. So, Ken mentioned capacity is really measured in throughput. It's the ability and power to do something. We measure it in terms of vehicles per unit time, essentially. And we're moving people and goods via vehicles usually. There are other capacity problems that are dealt with in this building at Metro Transit. Pedestrians and trains can reach capacity too, but it's not something I know anything about. So this is kind of what I want to touch on today, but feel free to stop me with questions along the way or stay with the end, whatever you prefer. So just one slide on theory, traffic flow theory. So I just want to get everybody in the frame of mind of kind of a bank or the state fair where you're waiting a long line for something. And the reason you're waiting a long line is because demand is exceeding capacity. And it's the same thing on our freeways and the same thing on our arterials. When you see a lot of congestion, demand is exceeding capacity, and you're essentially waiting your turn to get through that bottleneck. So as I mentioned, capacity is really measured as per unit time, as a rate. And then when it's a problem is when demand exceeds capacity, and you see that in the queuing that takes place. So this is kind of what you would see in a Traffic 101 class, went to the event. And it is the relationship between demand and throughput. So density is really the number of vehicles on the road, the number of vehicles that want to travel. And then flow is the number of vehicles past a point. So really kind of a measure of the productivity of that road. And you can see how at low density levels, we produce low levels of travel. And that makes sense in the middle of the night. As density increases, more travel is produced. But at a certain point, that curves backwards, and that is congestion. That's pretty extreme congestion. So it doesn't happen in all forms of capacity, but in freeways, actually, when you put too many cars on a freeway, you can actually reduce the amount of throughput on the road. And that's why we've done ramp metering. Part of ramp metering breaks up platoons, but part of it is to manage this demand capacity relationship. It's also part of how MnPass operates, in that we try and keep to the left of that peak on that curve, so that we're operating at maximum efficiency, keeping cars moving. But we do that by restricting demand with a price. So 2,000 is kind of a round number for capacity of a freeway lane. And you might have heard of level of service on highways. That's how we measure kind of the conditions on the highway. So capacity occurs at that level of service EF boundary. And that's starting, you're starting to really see shock waves moving around and slowing traffic. This is just an example of kind of the way that the backwards bending curve works, in that 1,000 cars an hour can occur kind of at low volumes, kind of really high speed traffic conditions, and it can occur at really severe congestion. And so the reason that that curve doesn't just go straight out, that cars don't just queue up and the road just operates just fine, producing the same level of volume, is really the relationship between acceleration and deceleration. We decelerate a lot faster than we accelerate, and then also we have a delay in our ability to react to that kind of thing. So that creates these shock waves, and it really is an inefficient way to operate a road. And that's why the curve bends down instead of going straight out. So in the simplest form, freeways are just pipes, lots and lots of different size pipes on different levels of demand. And it's just a question of, is volume above capacity or not, as to whether you're going to see congestion or not. So bigger pipes can carry bigger volumes without kind of exceeding that threshold. There is, of course, some complexity in freeways, and weaving is a prime example. Weavings where different traffic streams have to cross each other. And E.O. Kwon from the University of Minnesota Duluth did some research way back when about the way weaving impacts capacity. And one of his conclusions was that in a weaving section like this with an auxiliary lane, a vehicle actually has to occupy space in both the lane it's in and the lane it's going to. And so you can see kind of the capacity in this section is actually, in those right two lanes, is half what you'd think it would be, because the vehicle needs both those spots. You can't move until you have a gap, but you haven't moved yet, so you're still occupying space. So that especially applies to short weaving sections. There are a lot of things to think about in terms of, if your exit ramps are backing up, that can block a lane and reduce your capacity. You might not see it in your volumes, but you'll lose a lane of capacity and you'll see it in your densities and things like that. And then the big complexity on freeways is just the size of the freeways, the number of entrances and exits and segments in between all these things. Data requirements in terms of each of these segments, different hours of the day, AM and PM are clearly differently, but even within peaks, different hours can operate a little bit differently. And then even different days of the year can operate really differently. We see this in driving up north in the summer, or different events. You can see the traffic patterns that causes. And then even like lane widths and curves in the road can reduce capacity. So those are things we're trying to pay attention to. Any questions on freeways? Try and touch on intersections a little bit. Ken?
Does the grade or do crests impact capacity? I've heard that is something that can impact capacity too.
So climbing a grade?
Yeah.
Absolutely. So classic example is northbound 169 in the area north of 55. We have a hill, and we have two lanes going up that hill. We have two lanes downstream and upstream with similar volumes, but that hill is the bottleneck. You also see this in the way we build some of our roads when we have truck climbing lanes. And, when we're going up steep grades, the trucks have a harder time with that, and so we want to get those out of the normal traffic stream. And that's all about the grades. Let's see. So traditional intersections, the simplest way to think about them is really called a critical lane analysis. And Pat can correct me over and over again if she wants, or she can choose not to. But a critical lane analysis, you're looking at the different movements that can't operate at the same time. And so that's usually what's going to limit your capacity at an intersection is you can't run eastbound traffic at the same time as southbound traffic because you'll have a crash at signals. Left turns end up being really, really important at signals. So in this case, you can see you can't run either of those two movements when this north to west left turn is moving. We do have some strategies to deal with left turns. We can go to double lefts. We've even got a couple of triple lefts in the Twin Cities. And then we've got some new intersection types out there. So kind of a common one is the diverging diamond interchange. And this is a good example of how to deal with a lot of left turns. On the left, you see a little image of the way the left turns work together at a traditional interchange with the freeway going north-south. You see how they cross each other. They cross paths twice. So that's pretty inefficient, incredibly inefficient. And so the diverging diamond actually pulls them to the outside of the road before they enter the interchange so that they never cross paths. So this is a really good strategy for dealing with a lot of lefts. It actually has the opposite impact on through traffic, that instead of through traffic not having to cross, the diverging diamond causes through traffic to cross twice. So it's not a magic bullet to all your problems, but if you have a lot of left turns, not so many through cars, it can be a good option to think about. Reduced conflict intersections have been coming up lately, super streets. In this case, a lot of times we're dealing with the left turns that can be so critical to capacity to signalize intersection. And on the cross street, we're going to reroute those around so that they become, instead of a left turn off the cross street, they become a right, a U-turn, and a through movement. And those are all much less impactful to the capacity of intersection. So we're letting drivers accomplish the same movement, but in a very less harmful way to the operation of that intersection. And we might have our first signalized RCI at 65 and Viking, thanks to a lot of people's hard work. Continuous flow intersection is one that we don't have in Minnesota, and I'm not aware of one even in the works in Minnesota. There's another way to deal with left turns, and what this does is you really get the lefts crossing the opposing traffic well short of the intersection. So instead of blocking all that traffic at the main intersection, you can cross them 1,000 feet to the south. And then, it's just a way to pull traffic out of that main intersection. You can get more green time to different directions.
I sensed a really good type of intersection type that was missing from that list.
Yeah. Only one?
Well, of course, the roundabout. Would you agree that the roundabout can go in?
Yeah. Roundabouts are great. I think we see it more as a safety tool, but depending on what's out there, yeah, they can be improvements in capacity. They can move a lot of traffic, for sure.
When we were doing analysis work, we were finding that roundabouts tend to have 10 seconds less delay per vehicle than signals do.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. And delay is a little bit different than capacity, but definitely related. And there's, we have single points out there, single point diamond interchange is a little bit different, where you bring all that turning movement into one central location. Trying to think of what other
tight diamonds.
Tight diamonds, pretty traditional, but try and fit them in a smaller footprint. Park close, deal with the left turn really well. If you have one left turn, you run it through a loop instead of intersections. There's a lot of tools out there. I think these are some of the fun ones. As Ken mentioned, grades can matter a lot. Even things you wouldn't think about, vertical clearance, horizontal clearance, just being in a confined space, people tend to slow down, and that can reduce your capacity. That can occur from trees and steep slopes. Anything people sense danger from, they're going to slow down, reduce capacity. Truck mixture is a big component of capacity, just because of the space they take up and how slow they can be to accelerate heavy trucks. There's kind of a long list of other things that affect capacity in smaller ways. So one of MnDOT's or Metro District's especially strategies for dealing with capacity deficiencies, congestion, is MnPass. And MnPass is kind of Minnesota's branding of hot lanes, is a more national term. And our first two MnPass lanes were HOV lanes for carpools and buses. But there was some spare capacity that was being unused, and in order to use that, what MnDOT did was set up a tolling mechanism to sell off that extra capacity on 394 and 35W. And since then, we've built one from scratch on 35E, and currently extending it all the way up to Conroe J, at least in the northbound direction. And it's just an extra lane next to all the general purpose lanes, but we're managing the level of traffic in that lane based on the price. So buses and HOVs get in first, but then the rest of the capacity is just kind of sold off. And the price fluctuates, I think it's every 3 minutes or less than that even, just to try and manage that demand, keep the operations well, kind of meeting expectations. And that kind of, the reason we do MnDOT pass is because we're really trying to prioritize people throughput over vehicle throughput. So that's the reason HOVs get an advantage. That's the reason transit gets an advantage. It's just from a highway perspective, a lot more efficient way to move people. And then it also kind of does a neat thing in terms of it gives you an option. When your trip is congested on a regular basis, that might be fine. But on this day, I have an appointment. I have an interview. I have kids I have to pick up. For whatever reason, those 3 minutes matter a lot to you today. I'm going to pay for a better trip, more reliable trip. So that, they can label. A long time ago, we struggled with the label of Lexus lanes, and I don't think we're struggling with it so much anymore, but it's pretty easy to target these as kind of serving people with a lot more money. But I think it's been shown that these provide a lot of value to even people that don't use them on a regular basis. That just, that once a month, that twice a month when you need it, they can provide a lot of value. And it's kind of a recognition that we're within our right-of-way constraints, we're kind of hitting the limits. And at some point, we're not going to be able to widen our roads more. And that, maybe this is our last best chance to really provide something different than a road that's just going to fill up again and again. The other, I think, important strategy in the Twin Cities kind of long-range plans for addressing congestion is really the congestion management and safety plan. And that's really intended to look at, instead of the traditional big projects, go and replace all the pavement and bridges and fix the problem. This is really supposed to come in a really targeted surgical way and improve things, a turn lane here, extending a turn lane there, auxiliary lanes on the freeways. Some of these small target improvements get pretty big fast, but that's kind of the intent. So this label CMSP gets thrown around a lot, and I think it gets confused because it can actually refer to 3 different things around here. And one is these formal studies that we've done to really document these problems and try and develop solutions. Another is that Metro does have a set-aside budget to deliver these projects every year. And then lastly, it's also kind of, I don't want to say sold, but explained as a philosophy in that you could describe CSP as low cost, high benefit, or you could describe it as lower cost, high benefit. And the difference is low cost, you might want to cap it at $3 million or something like that. Whereas lower cost, you might say that if you can go in and replace a $100 million project with a $40 million fix, that's lower cost. And that, I think, meets the intent of CMSP and the philosophy. So CMSP1 was a study that was done way back, probably 10 years ago, and we've built almost 20 projects. These 10 plus are more like traditional concrete and bituminous projects, but there's also a number of ramp metering corridors, signal timing corridors that came out of that report that were implemented. And CMSP3 was just a few years ago, and I don't know if we've built at least a dozen different projects. These are some of the newer ones you've seen. Those first 2 are actually in operation. Auxiliary lane on 494 isn't built yet, but it's being delivered, I think, in fiscal 2018. It's a nice way to go at targeted problems that might have waited a lot longer if we were kind of in the traditional mode of fixing things. And then it's also a way to kind of spread things around in terms of, we deal with a lot of cities and counties that want to see, action, and it's a way for us to do that for a lot of people. A little bit on the performance measures that we're using. The congestion report's been around for almost 20 years, and that's just really looking at recurring congestion. So it's a typical weekday during October each year that's recorded here. And we're just measuring the duration of congestion. So we measure speeds below 45 miles an hour are congested, above aren't. And then you can see we have the geography of that congestion, so we can measure it in terms of mileage too. Some newer ideas that are being implemented in some places are delay. And what that adds to the conversation is we can now describe in our measures the difference between 40 and 30 and 20 miles an hour, which we couldn't when we just had the 45 mile an hour threshold, but clearly matters to the public. And then we also incorporate the number of drivers that are affected. So it's just weighted by the number of drivers. So you can imagine at the simplest level of, a 4-lane freeway versus an 8-lane freeway with the same duration and extent of congestion is probably, affecting a very different number of drivers. And then not really implemented yet, but definitely being studied is reliability. So the idea that instead of studying a typical day every year and building and designing for that, we want to think about that for sure, but also considering snow events and crash events. And, maybe the strategies aren't the same strategies for dealing with those things, but MnDOT does have a lot of that stuff within our control. So really looking at a bigger picture beyond a typical day. I labeled our TMC under kind of the future of congestion management. It's the future, but it's been around since 1969 on 35E at St. Paul. So but it is kind of the non-traditional strategies of kind of doing more with less. Really, if we're going to build a lane, let's keep it operating as much as possible during the rush hour. If there's a stall on the side of the road, that's kind of constraining the roadway and reducing capacity. Let's get it out of there as fast as we can. A couple of dollars worth of gas is really cheap in terms of the congestion relief we can provide. And that's one thing that the first or highway helpers would do, or changing a tire to get somebody out of there an hour earlier versus waiting for AAA. They're also working with the state patrol to just find incidents and communicate that information to people in the field better. So not really the future, but definitely a little bit more thoughtful way of dealing with their system. So autonomous vehicles are a fun topic. I'm going to win a lunch bet in about 7 years on autonomous vehicles. And so my bet is that they will have a measurable impact on capacity and congestion in that time frame. And there are a lot of ideas out there that have been coming in 2 years for 20 or 30 years, and this is definitely one of them. I mean, this has been around for decades and decades. I forget how far back it goes, but it's been around for a long time. But at this point, there's a dozen or more car makers that are making real investments in this technology. There are even car makers that are making real commitments in terms of timeframes of delivering these cars inside of 5 years. It's not all black and white. There's a lot of this technology that's actually in cars already today in terms of just better lane keeping, smarter, just a lot of technology that helps us drive better or takes some of those tasks away from us. The way that's going to affect capacity is that so today we tend to drive about 2 seconds behind the car in front of us. And some of that is definitely reaction time, and you can imagine a computer doesn't require the same reaction time of a person. Then also just the safety benefits are really what's being touted more than anything with the autonomous vehicles, but that has indirect effects on capacity and throughput in terms of less crashes blocking the lane, less crashes on the side of the road are going to matter to congestion and capacity of our roads. Let's see, loss and spare capacity is just kind of a newer measure. And again, when I say newer, this has been around for 10 years at least, but we're finally just recently starting to be able to really crunch the amount of data we need to display it on a corridor over a period of time. And what this is getting at is really the difference between the left side of the EF boundary and the right side of that EF boundary. You know, when your road is empty, you have spare capacity, and it's an indication you might have overbuilt the road. When a road is congested and stopped traffic, that's measured as lost capacity, and it's an indication that something's not quite going right. So it's just a different way to show some of that information and help understand where an auxiliary lane might work for down freeways. And then, not sure if I get this to run. This is kind of a fun idea. I hope. I don't know if that'll work.
Maybe right click.
Control.
Right click didn't work.
Is the control key on click it doesn't work?
That's interesting. So you can imagine if the day we have autonomous vehicles, we don't need intersect signals anymore, and you can imagine traffic streams from different directions just bleeding through each other instead of taking turns. That might be a long one. It's ways off.
That we're bleeding through each other.
Yeah, maybe that was the wrong description, but I'll just pull it up.
Well, I'm pulling this up. Maybe you could answer. One of the things that I recall vaguely from highway capacity manual training is that 2,000 vehicles per lane per hour. I think that one of the criteria in that is with that, I think we've got a measured headway distance between vehicles of like 1.1 seconds. And so if we actually do follow the 2-second rule, we're dramatically reducing capacity. So what would you advocate for your child to do?
Yeah, so I think it's a 2-second following actually equates to 1,800 vehicles per hour, and we'd have a lot more congestion on our roads if we all drove 2 seconds apart from each other. I think I'm going to advocate for my child to drive the 2-second rule.
There's just a big article in the Wall Street Journal, I think, about some guy who's done his own study, and they've gone through Europe now and actually having that 2-second gap for merging and diverging that allows people to get in and reduces the spillbacks and the slamming of the brakes and stuff, where some people that really are up on the bumpers of people, it doesn't allow people to get in, so the person in this lane has to kind of wait a lot longer, where if he would have been able to get in,
Right.
it would have reduced the congestion in that. I got it on my desk.
Yeah, no, I'm sure. The trick is that if you do get to that 2 seconds rule, you're greatly reducing capacity, and so leaving too much of a gap is really a systematic problem.
I think maybe it's discussing giving a gap for people as they are merging in by you instead of maybe crowding up.
And it probably leads to less turbulence if nobody has to brake and then accelerate again. And yeah, I can imagine that matters.
Okay, I can't get to it, unfortunately.
It's a fun video. They've got like a 10 or 12 lane highway, and you can just see traffic coming from the different directions crossing each other, and it's not in platoons like you'd normally see. It's one car at a time.
It's up above.
Yeah. It's just a modeling. It's just a model. It's not actually. It's not real. It's out there a few years.
The day that it's illegal to drive your own car over.
Yeah. No, absolutely. You wouldn't have people driving anymore.
So one of the things that we're doing with work zones is that I believe Metro has conducted a study about the capacity of work zones. Have you been involved in that at all? Do you know?
No. I saw an old one that URS did in terms of the zipper merge.
I think our experience has indicated that a work zone single lane can handle about 1,400 vehicles per hour.
Yeah, and then you can imagine a lot of times a work zone lane is going to be narrower. You might have cones on one or both sides. You could have really limited shoulders. You might have sharper curves. You've got a lot of things going on that are distracting drivers and causing them to want more headway and definitely reduce capacity. Okay.
So, if you go to, you tell people you work at MnDOT and
you get so over and over again, people just tell you, you know, if we just added more lanes, we'd solve the capacity problems, or we'd solve congestion.
Yep.
What are some of the drawbacks of just adding lanes? I mean, I know cost is an obvious one, but I know there's a lot of other things that when you add lanes, it creates a lot of other issues as well. And, you know, can you just speak to some of those?
So we don't have the money to do it, so we don't really have that option. So, but if we could do it, we maybe shouldn't do it because, you know, we're causing a lot more runoff into our rivers and a lot more flooding. We also have to remember that a lot of these, you know, these last lanes that we might want to build might have real great benefits, you know, 1 out of 24 hours a day. So especially more of like an urban, suburban environment, to have that much right of way taken up by just, you know, something that's not productive 24 hours a day is taking away from taxable uses and, you know, productive uses that aren't taxable. So, yeah. And then I think it's not a consensus, but I think, you know, looking at longer term, you know, 20 years plus, we design our highways for 20-year kind of a life. And when you look out that far, you have to consider technology changing. And in fact, the first project study that I've ever been a part of that is considering that is the 94 Between the Downtowns project. And they're actually modeling a scenario that, you know, they're modeling scenarios where we add lanes, where we don't really add lanes, you know, different scenarios. But one of the scenarios they're including is, what if autonomous vehicles come and we don't do anything? How much of the problem does that solve by itself? And I guess Professor Levinson's done work on this. I've heard him speak, and a lot of other people are doing work. But my understanding of the best expectation of autonomous vehicles is that it's going to add and decrease congestion in different places. And it's because of, you know, now all of a sudden, you know, if you drive an hour to work, it doesn't cost you that hour of time anymore. Now you can do whatever you want. So you might be more willing to live further away. But then also maybe in a city, you don't need all these parking lots because that car is going to drive you off at the door and it's going to go pick somebody else up, or it's going to go park remotely. So now all of a sudden a city has a lot of land to capture for, you know, anything, whether it's shops or parks or whatever. But yeah, that's fun and hard to think about.
And there's also now that people who couldn't drive before now can drive.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Old people, kids, disabled. Yeah, no, there's a lot of real benefits to it. I mean, the safety side of things, I think, you know, I've heard like 90% of crashes, 90% of fatalities can be reduced, and I kind of think that's a really conservative estimate in my mind.
Even now, adaptive cruise control, if all vehicles had that, it would dramatically reduce prevent crashes.
Yeah.
Just by that alone, our work zone, that would help a work zone.
And besides cruise control, there's just, you know, there are warnings that'll give, you know, if you're getting too close to the car, or if you're not decelerating at the same rate as the car in front of you, the cars will give you warnings on that kind of thing. And there's a lot of safety benefits already, I'm sure. Great, thanks.
Well, are there any questions online?
No.
For those online, if you'd like to ask any questions, just type it into the chat box at the bottom there. And in lieu of that, maybe that'll pop up. I just kind of wanted to thank Tony for coming to give this presentation. We'll do a handshake type thing. There we go. And want to also mention that our next traffic topic is going to be November 15th. Again, it's the third Tuesday at 2. You know, we have the 3 T's there. But anyway, way to remember, a little mnemonic there for you. But it's going to be Howard Preston, and he's going to be doing a traffic topic on the introduction to the MnDOT. There are a lot of questions out there. What is a manual uniform traffic control devices? A lot of people within MnDOT are aware of it, but even within MnDOT, there's a lot of confusion over what that document is and what it exists for, let alone people who are like township officials that are supposed to honor what the MnDOT says, but have no clue, never even heard of this document. So we're hopefully this will be a useful thing for people to watch and learn more about that document. So I'd like to, again, thank Tony, and thank you for being able to make it, and we'll see you next time. Appreciate it. Glad you enjoyed it.
Tony, I like how you mentioned something about land use. I think that's a really good goal.
In the cities?
Yeah,
Oh, yeah.
and you know, just the whole idea of how much space we eat up with parking lots.
Oh, is it like a third of our cities
Yeah,
or
and you
something like
know,
that?
how much productive land are we taking out of use for cars?
But if you think about it,
That's just for sure.
I'm not